There we go.
Great.
Okay, awesome. Ooh, it's been a minute since I looked at my questions, so hopefully they're somewhat articulate.
Yeah, I'm sure
Um,
they're great.
thank you. First, my professor was curious about the early life of our interviewees that led to the life that they've created now. So, if you have any context of like how you grew up or your education or what led you to this point.
I think for me, much maybe like you in beautiful Bar Harbor, Maine, I became really interested in studying the power of nature, the power of art, the power of exercise, the power of service and belonging, and its effect on our health because I grew up very fortunately on a forest and a lake. Spent a lot of time with my brothers, playing outside. And so when I also grew up in a really small, tight-knit community, and in kind of a community where friendship was really prioritized. My parents too, I remember they always have lots of friends turned family around. And so when in 2018, I was a graduate student and I was trying to understand, how these things can actually show up in our healthcare system. I was really excited when I learned that the UK had established a minister of loneliness and that there was real hard research showing that when people are connected to other people and an activity that matters to them, their health improves in all these ways. It's not just their loneliness, it's depression, it's anxiety. So that's a bit about my origin story.
Yeah, no, that's beautiful. I feel like I almost had the opposite, where now that I'm in a community like that, I sort of always knew that that was lacking, but to see what a difference it makes. I grew up an only child with a single parent and very much in isolation. I was like, go be alone with your room with your one computer thing for hours. And so I definitely relished whenever I could run outside or climb a tree. And yeah, now this community, I mean, half the people walk around barefoot. So it's lovely.
That's cool.
Yeah. Okay, so let's see. So what was the lead up to the connection cure? So, the process of realizing that this was a book that needed to exist, what the interview process and research was like.
So, yeah, I mean, after that story I just shared about becoming interested in loneliness, it just so happened that 2 years later, we had this pandemic and lockdown.
Yeah.
And we all started to experience the pain of social isolation, the pain of loneliness, the pain of being disconnected from things that matter to us. And this all started out as an article. I'm a journalist, so this started out as an article reporting on some people who had been lonely and in some cases had experienced other health conditions, type 2 diabetes, depression, chronic pain, and who had been beneficiaries of this thing called social prescribing. And I'm not sure if I defined it before, but social prescribing is this idea of having healthcare literally prescribe you a spot in a community based activity or a resource that helps you reconnect to something you love. And so those first two articles, one was about a man who was prescribed a cycling course, the other was prescribed about a woman who was prescribed a volunteering gig with children.
Mhm.
Both of those things dramatically improved not only their mental health, but their physical health as well. The man on type 2 who had type 2 diabetes had been on insulin, ended up being able to come off his insulin. The woman who was dealing with chronic pain was able to find relief from some of her symptoms. And so when I wrote that first article, I actually just got an email from someone saying, you should write a book about social prescribing. I'm not sure that one exists.
Yeah.
And it's been true. There had been a lot of books about generally the health benefits of time in nature. A book I always recommend is Nature Fix by Florence Williams.
Mhm.
There had been some new books coming out about the health benefits of art and music, but none were really rooted in the stories of people who had been prescribed these things because health social prescribing at that time was so new.
Mhm.
And so, yeah, then we turned it into a book proposal, and I was able to go around the world really to interview people who had been beneficiaries of this.
So cool. Um, so you talked about the core tenets being nature, art, movement, belonging, and service. So how did you come to that conclusion? What did you said there was like these themes that came up in these interviews. So how did that come about?
Yeah, well, I think that's part of it. It were the themes that came up in interviews. And it also has to do with the fact that we evolved as humans to be
Mhm.
among those five ingredients. We evolved to move our bodies, we evolved to spend time in nature, we evolved to be able to tell stories with one another and try to survive together. So, for most of our lives, movement, nature, art, service, and belonging weren't optional. Depending on how well we did with them, we were more likely to survive. And I think that has to do with a second reason why it's these five ingredients, which is that the evidence that exists around these five. For example, we know now that time in nature can dramatically reduce our production of cortisol, the hormone associated with stress. It has all these anti inflammatory benefits. Same with exercise. We've seen that exercise is really good at fighting chronic inflammation, considered the root of all disease, and can also have these mood boosting properties. Same with art, same with volunteering, and most importantly, same with belonging. If you look at the other side of that, there's research showing that when we're disconnected from other people, when we feel lonely, when we feel excluded or socially isolated, we register that as physical pain. And so the opposite is also true, that when we do have people in our court, people we can rely on. Some research shows it can extend our life. I mean, these researchers at Harvard found that the number one predictor of a person's um, longevity was the strength of their social relationships.
Wow. That's it's such a fascinating correlation because I feel like people wouldn't assume that.
Yeah, yeah. People, I think, they think about the obvious things, diet and exercise, and
Yeah.
of course, that's important, but at the end, when you hold all the other factors constant,
Mm.
that is what came out as being the most important thing.
Wow. What have you found to be the significance of salutogenesis, or as you've described it, the study of health and its impact on our everyday lives when it comes to maintaining healthy communities?
I'm not sure I understand. Could you rephrase that?
Yeah. How has the study of salutogenesis or health really impacted communities as a whole, prioritizing that kind of research?
Well, so I guess I'm having a hard time understanding. I'll say that, salutogenesis is the study of what makes us healthy.
Yeah,
And one of those factors, as we were just talking about, is the strength of your community.
yeah,
So I would say that, like, that is kind of the answer.
yeah.
Salutogenesis, research has suggested, is the extent to which you feel connected to your community, is the extent to which you feel a sense of purpose. And all of those things go on to drive health. Um, so, yeah, and maybe that's just another way of, remaking the point that movement, nature, arts, service, and belonging, these are the things that have been found to create health.
Okay. Yeah, I think I don't know why I phrased it like that, but yeah, not just a sense of community helping individual health, but the prioritization of that helping the community as a whole, prioritizing people's health and
Oh, I see. Yeah, I think that's right. I think that, our health and healthcare right now is very individualistic. And I understand now that maybe this idea of investing in the factors that make us healthy, this is not just about the individual, it's about uplifting the population. And so, yeah, I think salutogenesis, which I should mention, and Ali sort of mentions this on the podcast too, is
yeah.
not a super widely used term. Um,
Mhm.
but I think in practice, it can look like preventative health care, it can look like population health. And, we know that when we invest in the factors associated with health, it drives not only individual health outcomes, but also population health outcomes. Like 80% of a person's health is dependent on their environment. So totally agree.
Could you describe the like what sets apart our focus on these attributes that make us healthy as opposed to just focusing on the study of what makes us unhealthy, which we've kind of prioritized in medicine?
That's right. I think that's it. Most of our research goes into um, cures. Most of our research goes into disease, really. We have this disease, we want a cure for it. And that makes sense. You think about, particularly in the United States, how a lot of research and funding works. There's not a whole lot of people who, based on a personal experience, are championing preventative health and the study of health. Even though people who have been through a social prescribing experience, number one, I think can attest to how powerful it is. And also, I think at the population level, we see that this does have some curative effects. It can improve our mood, it can reduce our symptoms around anxiety and depression and attention disorders. And in doing so, it can also reduce pressure on health care. So, in other words, the example I like to talk about in my book, The Connection Cure, is about this man who would show up to the emergency room on Friday nights.
Mhm.
And every time he'd come in with sort of these mystery symptoms, and the doctors would sort of say, this is really interesting. He's only coming in on Friday nights. And finally, they asked him, and the man said, I come in on Friday nights because I don't want to spend my weekends alone.
Mhm.
And then by, being able to connect that person to a social prescription, you're not only better treating their root cause of distress, but
Mhm.
you're also saving on healthcare resources. So I think the whole ethos of social prescribing, shifting the focus from what's the matter with a person to what matters to them,
Mhm.
has been really effective in driving all these positive health outcomes, care outcomes, and also improving our own well-being in the meantime.
Awesome. Did any themes about the importance of third spaces come up in your interviews?
Yeah, that's a huge piece of it, I think. I mean, even in my early interviews before, I'd learned about this solution called social prescribing and just talking to people who were lonely.
Mhm.
That was what a lot of those people said. We want to make friends, but we don't know where to do that besides the bar or besides university or the workplace. And yet, in that first interview, I had people from all ages. I had people who were single, married, old, young. It didn't seem to matter because I do think that there has been this sort of decline of third spaces where people can meet or and culturally want to meet. There was a great book that came out by Dr. Robert Putnam called Bowling Alone. And
Mhm.
that title comes from this idea that more Americans are bowling than ever before, but um, at the same time, there are fewer bowling leagues. And it has to do with this idea that people are still doing things, but they're doing them on their own. And so, even though, I mean, that's sort of a different point, I think it relates to this idea that even though there are still bowling alleys, the infrastructure of people doing them in a group has declined as well. And
Yeah.
what's been cool with social prescribing is seeing how quote unquote third spaces that used to be used for one purpose, such as a church or a religious space, are now also being used to host yoga classes and choirs and dancing lessons and all sorts of other community based activities.
Yeah. That's incredible. It's so cool to see communities come together and implement these things and actualize those necessities. Um, again, shouting out Ali and ologies, but it was mentioned there that 20% of our health is clinical and 80% is environmental. And so, do you have any recommendations for modifications an average person could add to their day or week that might make a difference in this well-being for them?
Sure. And I think this is a great place to end. I always like to end on giving people tools they can walk away with in their own lives. not all of us may have access to a social prescription. Maybe not all of us have a doctor or a therapist or a social worker who believes in this. But all of us can have access to movement, nature, art, service, and belonging if we think about it.
Yeah.
It's true that social prescribing maybe makes it easier around costs, transportation, but I like to start by asking people sort of variations of the what matters to you question.
Hmm.
Maybe it's what did you love to do as a kid, but haven't had a chance to do since? And this kind of comes full circle with where we began.
Yeah.
Or what's something you could spend hours thinking about, hours working on without feeling like any time has gone by? Or if you had 2 more hours in your week, what would you spend it doing? Those sorts of questions can help us get to a sort of sense of what really has mattered to us throughout our life. And then from there, I have a list on my website, socialprescribing.co, of all the different, opportunities that exist for people to engage in these 5 ingredients, but it probably is around one of the five. And I recommend then looking up what's being offered at local parks departments, what's being offered through libraries, what's happening through websites like Meetup, especially if they're free.
Yeah.
These can be really great sources. And even if you can't find a group, I would say just start with yourself. For me, it looked like 20 minutes a day, no matter what, I have to get outside and walk.
Yeah.
Ideally, I leave my phone at home and I look up at some trees. For others, it might be doodling. For others, it might be reading. So yeah, I think that's a great place to start for folks who want to integrate this into their lives, but maybe don't have healthcare on their side right now.
Of course. Thank you so much for your time. This was wonderful.
Thank you so much, Morgan. Good luck with this project,
Thank
and it's
you.
great to meet you.
Great to meet you as well.
Okay, take care. Bye.